Thank you everyone for joining us today for our COVID-19 HR session. My name is Christina Wood. I'm the Director of Programming at Communitech for the Start and Scale group. So I just wanted to do a bit of an introductory before I turn it over to our presenters. So on the call today, we have Nancy Buck, who is an executive HR strategist, as well as Communitech growth coach. We have Suzanne Hyatt, who is also an HR specialist and Communitech growth coach. And we have Evan Campbell joining us from Miller Thomson. He's a partner there specializing in employment law. So thank you to the three of you for joining us today.
Great, thanks, Christina. First, I want to start by saying great job for hanging in there and for working through these business challenges. I know it's been a really rough few weeks for all of us. Arguably, even from a social and business perspective, we've likely seen the fastest changing business environment in history. In little more than 24 hours, people were asked to relocate their team members to work from home, a move that perhaps many of you would never have considered under normal conditions. And while I know that it was primarily done under government order, you got your head around it. And for the most part, even though we're learning, we're making it work. Many of you have questions about how to make that work from home more effective, and we'll give you some of those ideas today. But I understand that many of you are also in the unfortunate situation where the pandemic has decreased company revenue and you may be running out of cash. Today, we'll also talk about those situations. Before I turn it over to Suzanne and Evan for some of the specifics, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about strategic direction. For those of you who know me, you know that I won't have a conversation about HR or people and culture without first tying it back to business outcomes, ensuring there's alignment between your business and your people strategy. And some of you have seen the driving business outcomes model that I tend to use. Christina will show it on the screen. And it's been tested on the ground for many years, and it still fits during these unfamiliar times. And I'd like you to think about it as a framework or a model to help support strategic decisions, creating those important linkages between what's happening in the market and the decisions that you need to make around people. I'd also consider it as a framework for you to use to communicate, because it's a way to communicate change based on what's happening in the market through direction that you need to set, and with the way the work is changing, you need to make decisions around your people. So please use it as that framework. I know some of you have asked about frameworks and models for business continuity and for making those kinds of decisions. I think this will be a relatively easy one to use. So let me walk you through it. Obviously, we're going to start at the very top. Obviously, the market landscape has changed significantly. Depending on the business you're in, your revenue may have stopped and it may not return. It may have stopped temporarily, but without any prediction on the length of time that will take. It may have slowed down, or in fortunate circumstances, it may have actually remained the same or increased. In alignment with what's happening in the market, you need to think about specific strategies and goals, programs to keep your employees productive and engaged, but for others, specific and significant financial strategies and goals to keep your business afloat. Those strategies need to be very clear before you make decisions on what work can get done and ultimately what you need to do for your people. Many of you are already doing scenario planning, and given that we don't know how long this will last or how long we will see the impact of COVID on your business, as you consider scenarios of impact for 3, 6, 9, 12 months, keep in mind that your strategies may and will likely need to change the longer this continues. Please continue to look back to the model and ensure that this alignment is in place in the next few months as well. And let's be realistic. As you run your scenarios, many of you will find yourself in a situation where what you want to do for your people, for example, may not align with what you can do based on your financial objectives. In those cases, tough decisions will need to be made. In the next section of the work, some of you may still have people working, small groups of people working at home if you've deemed to be an essential service. Others are working from home exclusively. And the reality is that decisions about work, what work can get done, or new work will also need to drive your people decisions. Who can keep doing the work they normally do, but from home? Who does not have work, but can be reassigned to other tasks? Some companies are redirecting their people to research and development initiatives. Who has a role that simply cannot be done from home? And who can do some of the work, maybe not in a full-time capacity, but could be redirected to things like community initiatives, for example. And of course, you may need to use some combination of all of these. Again, they all need to be aligned to your financial strategies and your goals. These variables then, and only then, can drive your decisions around people. Some options, like the new wage subsidy program that we know you're all waiting for details on, are brand new options that have never been part of our arsenal. And as you know, they are changing daily, and we won't have a lot of those details for you today. But today we want to find out what's on your mind, answer the questions you have as best we can, and work towards getting you answers on those questions we do not yet have answers for. Of course, you're all in very different scenarios, so we'll try and address both ends of the spectrum. The scenarios of how to, on one side, keep your current teams engaged and productive and motivated during these times, and on the other side, how to potentially change the composition of your team to align with your new financial realities, if that's a situation you find yourself in. I'm going to turn this over to Suzanne for some more specifics on some of these scenarios.
Great, thanks, Nancy. Hi there, everybody. I hope everyone is having a good day today. I think to open, I just wanted to share that I have spent over 20 years in this community working in tech and within scaling organizations and working with HR teams. And I think that we're in a point now over the last number of weeks where I feel like I've taken my best practices guidebook and I've almost thrown it out the window. Things are changing so quickly that it really is looking at how we've done things and how they now apply in this environment. So I'm going to start. I think for me, the Ask Me Anything portion of today would be really valuable to understand the questions that you have, just because the questions that I've been receiving over the last, let's say, 30 days as this has been evolving and changing, really they are case by case. So we'll look forward to those questions as they come in. Can we move to the next slide, Christina? So I think when we look at COVID-19, I mean, we can all acknowledge there's information coming at us at an alarming pace. And I think from an HR perspective, it's almost difficult in some cases to digest all of the information that's coming in as quickly as it is and consider how that is impacting the team. And that information is coming at us as HR professionals and as leaders in organizations at the same time that it's coming into the team. So to this point, we've seen a lot of the global efforts that are really focused on concurrently lessening the spread and impact of the virus, noting that as we put things in place in organizations, in some cases they're changing hour by hour. I know that last week I felt that, I had a plan in place and then 24 hours later, I was revisiting that plan. So we're really seeing that things are evolving very quickly. Can we go to the next slide, please, Christina? So I wanted to just talk about business continuity and coronavirus in the sense that kind of the lens that I've taken with the leaders that I've been talking to. A lot of organizations weren't prepared to mobilize as a remote workforce, as Nancy noted, at the pace with which they were required to. And even those that may have had a business continuity plan that were a bit farther along, a lot of them hadn't tested it or they hadn't done those test work from home days. So a lot of this is new territory for many. What I have seen in the companies that I've talked to is that, depending on size, stage, the market that they're in, potentially the tools or technology that they have in place, people have really adapted to that environment and have responded very quickly to that. Organizations leading up to last week had typically been taking a phased approach. So looking at how they could look at the risk posed by COVID-19, how they created a safe work environment, and then also how they support the health and wellness of the team while also balancing the impact to the business. So many of the efforts that I've been looking at have really been about how to increase awareness and preparedness for employees, and also then how you prevent exposure to the team in order to limit the spread of the disease. This, I acknowledge that depending on the organization, depending on if you have a hardware, if you're manufacturing, if you're purely software, so the type of product or service that your business provides will definitely impact that as well. And I've also heard of many that are almost establishing COVID-19 task forces. So this can be a cross-section of the organization where you can talk about the changing requirements and the impact of to the business. And, you know, this really is, there's different people that can play a role in this. So that might be a cross-section of individuals that is your HR, whomever wears your HR hat, your finance hat, your technology hat, your marketing hat, and those sorts of things. And then from a business continuity perspective, really thinking about how you look at those core processes, people, and places that are critical to sustain the business, and how you evolve with this. Next slide, please. So one thing that I have leading up to the mandated work from home that we've all seen in the last week, what I have found helpful is to determine a key set of status items. So whatever that might mean for your business, this is just an example, but what are the things that your employees may need to navigate in light of COVID-19? And I share this because we saw this changing as it was continuing to escalate to a mandated work from home scenario. But we'll also see I don't know if the de-escalation is the right word, but we will see this evolve when we are getting back to the workplace. So in this case, business travel, personal travel, the impact of travel and benefit restrictions, potentially how you handle candidate interviews and on-site interviews, but almost determining what those key items are that the employees will have questions about, that you can create, that your task force, so to speak, can speak about and communicate on regularly to ensure that you're aligned on how those are handled. Next slide, please. So from a standard HR practices, and I state this because, you know, many of the things that we may know as from a work from home sick policies, and I've included a list here just as, you know, more as way of example, because I think this is where the Ask Me Anything will really come into light. But for example, work from home policies, regardless of what an organization's position may have been from a work from home perspective, you know, you're in a position now where you're looking to enable a work from home environment with your team and how you best leverage that. So I've seen a lot of questions in all of these areas. What might be standard HR programs? And the conversations are now shifting to how you really focus on thinking about potentially, it's first and foremost, health and safety, wellness programs, mental health. So conversations are shifting inside organizations. And then if you are continuing to hire, if you've got positions that are in that, then you've got to also think about how you continue to onboard and offboard in this way. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about, I've been talking about business as usual as business as virtual, because I don't think there is a business as usual today. I think that would be, you know, I don't think that you could state that. But where I have seen people trying to move to a business as virtual is looking at recommending that team members look at how they can set themselves up in a remote work arrangement. I think even where we have people that may have worked from home, they may now have multiple multiple family members trying to work from home. And so that has now changed for them. Of course, communicating, as we know, is always important, but over communicating in this time, and how you can schedule those regular touch points with teams, doing 15-minute check-ins and doing virtual connects where you can. And then, of course, some supporting it to transitioning to a work from home arrangement, but really acknowledging if you can look at how your employees can create a space that they can work, you know, continue to engage with the team, and then looking at how they can continue to iterate that. And we are still encouraging that, you know, employees continue to communicate with their manager and HR lead, whomever that may be, if they are presenting with flu-like symptoms. I think this is definitely something we want to ensure maintaining confidentiality for the team, but with a work from home arrangement, it does allow you, your managers, to continue to support and triage the work requirements and support the team members if they have any requirements there. And this is just provided for future reference, some information should it be helpful. And I'll pass it over to Evan.
Thanks, Suzanne. It's a pleasure to be here virtually. As Christina mentioned, I'm a labor and employment lawyer with Miller Thomson, and I just want to take this opportunity to touch on a few issues that I've been receiving questions from clients about. And this, my little segment could be entirely about one of these issues. So my goal here is not to provide a substantive overview, but really just touch on it high level and hopefully answer some of the questions you have. And I'm going to talk about 3 different issues. Firstly, I'm going to touch on temporary layoffs. Secondly, discuss ways to mitigate the risk associated with temporary layoffs. And lastly, I just want to touch very briefly on the new wage subsidy program announced by the government with more details this morning. So I want to start with temporary layoffs. And I'm sure many of you have seen the articles or have heard the interviews by lawyers discussing that temporary layoffs can be what's called a constructive dismissal, or even some lawyers saying, hey, temporary layoffs are quote unquote illegal. And this has resulted in numerous emails and telephone calls from concerned clients because due to the economic reality, many organizations are faced with deciding whether they do temporary layoffs. So I think it's important to start with that the Employment Standards Act does permit temporary layoffs. But it gets slightly more complicated when we consider what's called the common law. And a temporary layoff, even if completed in compliance with the Ontario Employment Standards Act, can, not is, but possibly can constitute a constructive dismissal if the organization does not have the express or implied contractual ability to perform the layoff. So an express term is, of course, something within a contract or potentially an employee handbook. An applied term is where the employer's industry has been subject to layoffs or if there's a historical practice of conducting layoffs. So historically, and I say historically because we're in unprecedented times, but if you didn't have this express or implied right, then a temporary layoff would constitute a constructive dismissal. But obviously, we're in, as I mentioned, unprecedented times. And I think what I'm telling my clients is that there's a number of reasons why I think layoffs are still a viable option in today's economic reality. And I would flag a couple issues for your consideration. Firstly, when you conduct a temporary layoff, even if you lack that contractual implied right, the employee essentially is given an election. Either they accept the layoff or they will commence a claim. But the practical reality of the economic situation nowadays is that I think we can all agree we're likely heading into a recession. Jobs are going to be hard to find. Most employees are not going to want to commence a claim and thereby give up their right for a potential recall. So I think there's some practical considerations there that need to be considered when doing that layoff and assessing that risk. Secondly, the government mandated shutdown provides a basis to justify a layoff due to this notion of frustration of the employment contract. So it's not as black and white to say that a layoff in this current circumstance constitutes a constructive dismissal. And then lastly, I would also flag, and this is something to consider with your own employment labor counsel, but even if an employee asserts constructive dismissal, one option is simply to recall them, and thereby you're capping the potential damages that that person is entitled to. So all this to say is I think temporary layoffs have a calculated risk because yes, there is the potential for a claim, but I think that risk is minimal and we're talking about today's economic reality. And I can say to you that I have had hundreds of individuals be laid off across various industries and the clients that I serve, and I have yet to receive a demand letter from opposing counsel or a claim. I think a lot of that news and discussion was led by plaintiff side counsel, maybe not for the best intentions in terms of their monetary interest. And again, I think it is a viable option. So, subject number 2 is, well, how do we mitigate that risk, Evan, if we have to do a layoff? And I think high level, I would suggest 2 things be considered. One is proper communication to staff to get buy-in that temporary layoffs are necessary to ensure continued success and viability of the business, but secondly, there's actually a chance of recall. And then secondly, I think another strategic option is to get employees' consent through some type of payment, and whether that's through a top-up payment of the EI benefits, but to get employee consent, and thereby they cannot assert a constructive dismissal through some type of payment. So layoffs, hopefully that addresses some concern based on the news articles, is a viable option when appropriate. And I want to touch very briefly, because I know probably many of you are watching the news this morning about the new wage subsidy, which was discussed by the Prime Minister this morning, or at least he provided a few more details. Again, we don't have all the particulars. They're supposed to come out tomorrow, is my understanding. And so we really don't have much in terms of the nitty gritty to provide to you today, but I just want to flag a couple points for consideration. Firstly, the Prime Minister talked today about eligibility based on a decrease in business revenue. What that actually means, we'll have to see, but obviously if you don't have revenue, then you may not be eligible. So I think important to monitor what those particulars are, but also consider all other options when you're planning in terms of your workforce. And I also think it's important to note that eligibility doesn't appear to be based on size in terms of number of employees or in terms of numbers of, size of the gross revenue brought in, which was the eligibility used for the initial 10% subsidy, which was announced. So again, really have to see those details. I think it could be a fantastic option depending on your circumstance, but one of numerous that warrants some due diligence to determine what's best for your organization. Pass it off to the question phase.
Okay, thank you, Evan. Let me just stop sharing my screen here so that I can get into the questions. So thank you, the three of you, for providing those insights today. We will turn it over to the group for some questions. So I will do my best to moderate and get to everyone's questions. Let's see here. So the first question is, what tools are available to employees' diligence in practicing COVID-19 protective behavior in order to help identify those who are at lowest infection risk for returning to the workplace?
I can speak to that. Generally, what I have been doing is relying on both the CDC, the World Health Organization, and then the local public health. As I mentioned at the outset, there is a lot of information coming at employers, but these are really the three that I've been referring to. I actually do have a really good one-pager that I can actually share with Christina as a follow-up to this. That's a one-pager that explains I believe it was produced by the WHO around quarantine, self-isolation, and social distancing, and those things that I've been sharing with employees to help explain what they should be thinking about. So I can share that as well. I think on the return to work, that still is evolving because we are hearing different time periods for how long someone may be exposed and how long they may be potentially contagious for, but we are hearing still a minimum of 2 weeks is what we're seeing as guiding principles. Whether that will change or not, I don't know.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne. The second portion of that question is, do we have any templates or guidance around reviewing business planning and processes as far as assessing and planning temporary and permanent layoffs? Update on any government support. So I think we kind of, Evan, you spoke to that a little bit in your section, but I'm wondering if there's any templates or guidelines that is available.
I can just speak to it very briefly. I'm not aware of any government issued templates or around in terms of that planning process, but I would just note we need to distinguish between a temporary layoff and a dismissal. So there's no such thing as a permanent layoff. If a person is not recalled within the periods mandated by the Employment Standards Act, then it becomes a dismissal. I think that raises an important consideration, which is, from my perspective, if there's no likely chance of recall, then you might as well engage in that termination upfront. And so I think part of to that question about planning is, okay, well, what is our cost of the layoff? Are we going to do a top up? What is that actual cost? And then also consideration, okay, we're laying off 30 people or whatever the case may be. These 5 we're never going to recall or very, very unlikely. Well, maybe we should just engage in termination now, pay them what their entitlements are, whether it's dictated by contract or otherwise, and allow those people to go out there and try to find new jobs. Because ultimately, if we don't recall them, it becomes a termination, but they've been essentially sitting at home, likely not searching for jobs, thinking that they may be recalled. Okay. I don't know if that answers the question on point, but.
I think so. The next question is, any recommendations for creative and fun things to keep people connected and engaged and still part of the team while working from home?
I can take that one, and I'm sure many of you have tried some of those things. So the companies are all trying to do different things. I've seen everything from random coffee chats with people to team meetings with contests about the best video backgrounds. There's a lot of things on social media. I would suggest that you take a look at what other companies are doing and try them for yourself. I've seen bingo. People are trying to figure out board games that will work. It really is important to think about the culture of your company, what you're trying to do, the kind of people you have, who's most vulnerable. Sometimes getting some of the more vulnerable people onto some of those committees to help pull people together is important. You really do need to look at your own organization and try some things and watch for things that other companies are doing and give them a shot. There's no one size fits all, but there's lots of ideas out there that are floating around on the web right now.
Great, thank you, Nancy. The next question I have here is, what would you suggest for a company that is just starting to build out their internal HR documents?
Not sure I understand the question.
So the second part to that is, I shared my 1-week immediate game plan, but in summary, step 1, internal and external assessment, step 2, plan, step 3, act. It's a question from Mike. So Mike, if you're still on the line, maybe if you could fill out another chat comment and just explain further what you mean there.
Christina, there was one question I just saw around, and I want to go back to business continuity. And it was regarding, what are the worst case scenarios if, a CEO or another essential leader becomes sick and isn't available to make high level decisions. One of the things that I'd suggest companies need to look at is who has things like signing approval. So if you're the only person who has signing approval becomes ill, who's second in command? And, Evan, maybe it's a legal question about how to create plans and legal documents that allow some type of, in personal terms, powers of attorney. I don't know what the business language is, to be able to transition to someone else if something like that needs to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Nancy, in terms of having some contingency plans and whether that's, directors of the organization being permitted to deal with some of those corporate and financial information. That's a good point. And I also say to the business continuity, I know I've had clients, simple things like, okay, well, how do we cash checks historically? How do we do that? Because usually there's multiple, depending on the size of the organization, sign-offs or approvals. So ensuring that can be done all remotely and testing all those things. And having those conducts in a row. But from a legal perspective, really comes down to the corporate documentation as to who has the authority to engage in either the corporate signing or the financial signing of the documentation.
Thank you, Evan. I've got a couple of questions here around the work-share program. So how long does it take to implement an official work-share program? What are the current timelines for government to approve it?
I can probably just talk about that very, very briefly. So I was just speaking to someone, or got an update, I believe it was Friday. So the government has made significant improvements in terms of approving the work-share. So previously it was a 30-day essentially period to wait. They've cut it down to 10 days. So my understanding is you file your application, really you have, they're processing them as fast as possible. So 10 days thereafter, you'll be able to commence your work share. Now, the only caveat I would have is I think that is a moving target given the amount of applications, both from a work share or in terms of the top-up approval as well. I know initially when the top-ups was going through, I was having clients be approved in 24, 48 hours. Then it went from a few applications to thousands, right? And so I know the approval time increased significantly. So as of Friday, my understanding was the government they're pumping them through as quickly as possible in 10 days.
Okay, thank you. I think this one is for you again, Evan. If you do a termination versus layoff, does regular severance apply even during COVID crisis?
Yes, is the short answer. So if you are terminating your employee, the normal termination factors will come into play. So ideally, we have an employment contract which will stipulate what they get in the event of a dismissal. And so we need to look to that in terms of what that specific employee's entitlements are. And so whether that's COVID or not, they're going to have those termination entitlements. And I think COVID may actually be an acre-baking factor to a certain perspective, because if we don't have an employment contract, then part of the assessment of what the person's entitled to is, well, how long will it take that person to find a new job? That's what, if you've heard of this common law reasonable notice idea. And so obviously with the economic reality we're heading into, that's going to be tougher. So I could foresee court saying, hey, person took him or her 6 months to find a new position. You have some enhanced exposure because it took so long. So short answer is all those same factors come into play.
Great, thank you. Following up on the work sharing question, this one's just looking for a little bit more detail. So work sharing application on the CRA site, what is the definition of a work sharing unit? It says that there needs to be a minimum of 2 people. So if that's the case, so if the 2 people can share the available hours, if you are a company of 9 people and you are all in the same unit, even if you are covering multiple departments, or would you have to submit several unit applications, one for finance, one for the admin group, one for each group, I think is the question. I'm not sure if that's clear, Evan, or if you want me to read that again.
No, I think I get the gist, and so I'll just try to answer it. And if not clear or I'm not answering a specific question, feel free to retype a clarifying question. But in terms of the workshare program, you're going to want to assess the units, which makes sense. So an organization can't have more than 1 unit, and part of this can depend on the size of your organization, right? If you only have 10 employees, then it probably makes sense to have 1 unit. But because within that unit, you have to share the hours. So generally, classic scenario, we're going to have production is going to have a unit because they're sharing those hours, right? Production is not going to share hours with the finance team, right? Because they're doing different types of work. So those quote unquote departments are likely going to have different units. And it may make sense that, hey, production, we don't have any work for production. We're going to share work in production, but we have X part of the organization which doesn't have to share work because for whatever reason. So you're going to have to assess the organization in terms of what makes sense. And my only comment about work share is the government does have a very detailed guide about the work share. I'm happy to share it with Christina if you can't find it, but it's very lengthy. It really talks about kind of the eligibility requirements, both in terms of employers, employees, the application process. The one thing I would flag for everyone about workshare is that it does require the consent of the employees. So there is some administrative steps that need to go in there. It's not like you can just, do this today and file it today. I guess you could, depending on the size of the organization. We're gonna have to go to the employees and get their consent and get their sign off before you file that application.
Christina, maybe just a couple of additional comments about workshare. So we've been on calls with Service Canada, the senior HR group, and have been asking a lot of questions to see whether it is applicable. And based on what we know about most of our tech companies and the kind of work that gets done, there are very few companies that have people in a unit doing exactly the same kind of work that could share the same hours, that could be an appropriate unit. Even software developers, you could argue they're doing the same work, but they're doing different tasks, even though they may be working on the same project. So I think it would be really hard to find any of our companies. Some of them may apply if there's hardware companies and so on, but really tricky to be able to define groups. and units. And yes, the voluntary piece is really important. Every employee in that unit then has to agree that this is something they want to do. So that's a secondary tricky component. And there was a question about sales agents. And yes, I've also heard that sales people are exempt from the work sharing program based on the advice I got from directly from Service Canada.
Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, that was going to be the next question that I raised here.
Christina, I could maybe speak to the question about just the HR foundations.
Mm-hmm.
I think the only thing I'd note there is, I think that is actually, I think whether it's COVID-19 or not, I would be looking to leverage the resources that you might find online or through groups that can help with through your network potentially, or through groups like I'm not sure what you need there from an HR basics perspective. There are some really good tools that are quite cost effective. There are some good resources, like if you're from an Ontario perspective, like HR Downloads and others. So I think I would try to, I'm not sure if there's a specific piece from an HR perspective, but I would try to think of it almost generally, and then look at what requirements you have and what's available and who you can leverage in your network maybe to get yourself set up. I'm not sure if that's answering that question more, but.
Certainly Communitech has a number of resources that we've used during quote unquote normal times that we're looking at potentially tweaking for virtual use. So onboarding tools is a good one where we've had onboarding resources, we've used them for their companies. We're going to take another look at them to see how do we tweak them now when we think about virtual onboarding, or recruitment tools where we now need to think about virtual recruiting. So there will be some tools available over time. I think those tools are pretty readily available. There's always tips online, but certainly reach back to us for specific tools, because if it makes sense for one company, it probably makes sense for a bunch of companies, and we can make sure we can put something together that would be useful for as many companies as possible.
Great. I also received a question here. Due to mandatory work from home, are businesses obligated to pay for home office setup during this time?
I can't answer that.
Yeah, I don't know if Evan has a comment from not to my understanding, but Evan, do you have comments otherwise on that?
Yeah, I don't believe you have to.
Yeah.
I would say, so I think the short legal answer is no, but then there's the practical answer. Okay, if you're mandating employees work from home and they don't have the tools to do that and they can't work, I think obviously you're gonna have operational issues, workflow issues. And then the question becomes, well, what happens when they can't do X project? Are they disciplined? Do they simply not get paid for not working? And then you're creating issues about layoff, et cetera. So I think obviously it depends on the organization's financial position, but most organizations that I'm working with are doing their best to ensure people have the tools to at least be successful. And I think that goes to a lot of the comments that Nancy and Suzanne were speaking about earlier about, getting, working together as a team remotely, et cetera. Well, you can't do that if someone doesn't have the tools.
I think we also need to do our best from a health and safety perspective. We do have an obligation to ensure that people are set up in an ergonomic kind of way, which is pretty tough when people are working on couches and so on. So I think from a goodwill perspective, as well as a safety and comfort and concern for our employees, that we don't have long-term claims on short-term disability and things like that, that we should be looking to do whatever we can do. That aside, I think there has also been some guidelines from a government perspective that employees can be writing off parts of their home office because we're now working in home office. So I've seen a couple of documents about that as well. So we should stay tuned and watch for those things, because it may be something that we can do from a deduction perspective, our home office on our income tax.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add from an HR perspective, what I've seen some do is actually just create a shared file where people can kind of note the challenges that they're having and look at how you might be able to solve for those. And if there are questions around, whether it's monitors or things like that, then just understanding what those are and triaging those requirements. Some have, if companies have personal spending accounts, for example, as a part of their benefit program, I've seen them kind of widening the things that people can use towards their personal spending account so that they can get the things that they need from a home office perspective. And I have seen some look at their overall budget, and if, for example, you're envisioning having your team at home for 2 months and you do other things in that might be meals or there's a travel component to the next couple of months, looking at those monies and seeing is there a certain amount that they can provide as a stipend or an expense offset, and looking at that. So just people getting creative with what they have, noting that on a stipend or in that scenario, that becomes a taxable benefit to the employee, but just really looking at what might work for each organization is kind of a couple things I've seen.
Perfect, thank you. There's another question here related to working from home. How do you deal with an employee who is checked out, mentally checked out while working from home?
Oh, who knows how to do performance management remotely? But I think that's really the question here is we need to, employees need to be trying to put in productive hours, and leaders need to be trying to work together to make them as productive, as engaged and energized in their work as possible. I think doing all the things we would do in the office, clarifying expectations, all those things are going to be really important. Giving feedback, making sure we're having daily check-ins, monitoring progress, all those things really are what's required and what is expected from an employee perspective. Yeah, it's going to be a little tougher than face-to-face. It may be a little harder to monitor, particularly if we don't have great employee metrics and performance metrics. But we still need to be doing all the things as if somebody was checked out in the office. Watching again for other reasons. I mean, the compassionate side of watching for people and whether they're struggling because of isolation and other things, critical, but we should be doing those things as if they were in the office as well. So that balance, empathetic leadership is really the key here. I don't know if you have anything else to add, Suzanne.
Yeah, no, I was just going to note that understanding the why is really important, but just we don't know what people's home circumstances may be. So, really having it, I think this is where the empathy side and really looking to get an understanding and seeing if there's other resources that they may need, because acknowledging that this is such a difficult time and, uncertain for so many. And I think, so the only thing I would add to Modesty's point too, I'm going back to the comments about ergonomics, that there are some really great resources online you can share with your employees to assist them in setting up their home office that's best for them. So, because, we do acknowledge that there are a lot of great resources online for that as well.
Yeah, and I want to go back and just reinforce what I said about, performance management. And the first thing before you even get to those kinds of things is to really understand the why. And I probably should have started with that more clearly. People are going to be struggling for lots of reasons. And are they struggling because of skill sets and things they can't do and new work that you've given them to do? But really starting from hey, I just want to have a conversation about what's going on with you. Those kinds of opening statements, guidance questions to really see if you can get to the depths of why what you're seeing is a lack of performance. What can look like being checked out could very realistically be something entirely different. So really starting from that perspective is going to be really important during these times.
I'm just scrolling through the list here to see if there's any questions that we missed to the group. If there's anything else that you would like answers to, feel free to add that into the chat. There was one for Evan specifically. It says, Evan, how would you compare that to a layoff where you ended up not recalling a few specific people? So I think this goes back, Evan, to when you were talking about layoff may being the better option if you're not going to recall some people back.
Yeah, so when we talk about layoffs and terminations, so to my earlier comment, you lay off. Ideally, you have a bona fide intent to recall that person. They buy in, they go off and layoff. You recall them, and you continue on in your operations. Of course, there's going to be circumstances where you have a good faith desire to bring them back. Circumstances change, things don't pick up like you had initially hoped, and that layoff becomes permanent, in which case they automatically become terminated. When they become terminated, partially depends on their own circumstances. Like if you, and this is where talking with your own legal counsel and coming up with some strategic options is important. But for example, if you know that someone has gotten a new job, you may want to try to have them recalled. And if they refuse and it becomes a resignation, and you avoid potentially your termination entitlement or obligations in that circumstance. Again, you need to think through the pros and cons of that approach. But if you don't recall them and their employment becomes terminated as a result, then they have the similar termination entitlements as they would if you had expressly terminated them at the beginning. And what the Employment Standards Act speaks to is that the termination date becomes the date of the layoff, essentially. And the only strategic issue often arises is that once we terminate someone, they have a positive obligation to attempt to find a new job. And that is what we call as lawyers mitigation. So if we do a recall and we don't essentially recall them, or so we do a layoff and don't recall them, and they become terminated, say they've been off for 12 weeks. Well, in theory, they've had no legal obligation to go out there and find a new job. And so you could have saved yourself some headache if you had terminated them and maybe at week 8, they went and found a new job, thereby minimizing your potential legal exposure in the circumstance. I think that's really the pull and take of that situation is if we terminate now, we're kind of pulling the Band-Aid off, we're giving them notice, we're going to, hopefully if there's an employment contract, we'll comply with those provisions. They're going to have an obligation to mitigate, hopefully to find a new job, and therefore you've minimized your legal exposure. If you do a layoff, you don't recall, it becomes a termination. They haven't had a real obligation to mitigate. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. They'll partially be driven by their own financial circumstance in a lot of situations, but you're going to have that termination liability without that duty to mitigate on part of the employee. Hopefully that makes sense. I know I kind of blabber on there about very legal issues, so let me know if there's any clarifying questions.
Great, thank you.
I think that's why it's really important to understand, your impact on your financial scenarios and run through your financials to figure out what it could look like. Because if it's going to look different at 6 months than it does at 3 months, than it does at 2 weeks, you need to know that before you make decisions. You need to take a look at, can the people continue to work or not work? Is there work for them to do? Do you have a business if this continues for 6 months or 3 months? Those questions answered really need to determine what you want to do in terms of your people approach. The other thing that I'd highly recommend is that you take a look at your benefits provider and find out what kind of coverage there is during temporary layoffs, for example. So I know for anyone who is on the Tech Life benefits, the Communitech Tech Life benefits through Manulife, temporary layoffs, they do provide full benefits for 120 days. So the question then is, do you want to run a temporary layoff, with full benefits for that same time period? So take a look at your benefits, know what the coverage is, because that may also determine some decisions that you make about your people, at least what kind of coverage they have. And with Tech Life, that's all benefits, including disability benefits, will run 120 days under that plan.
Great, thank you, Nancy. There is another question here around the wage subsidy. So does the wage subsidy, as far as you know, only apply to employees who were laid off, or can it be used to keep the business going and your current employees working from home? I've heard varying reports.
I'm happy to comment on this. So my understanding is that the wage subsidy will be applicable to employees who are working, not laid off. Really the goal of that is to keep employees working. And I think the other concept or other tool is the sub plans, the supplementary unemployment benefits plans, which permit employers to top up employees when they're laid off. So I think maybe the information you're getting is confusing those two different tools. So one, we have the subsidy where your employees continue to work. If you're eligible, you get the subsidy. I think the other issue with the subsidy too is like, how are you gonna get that money? I know with the 10%, I believe it was through tax remittances, like you wouldn't have to remit as much taxes. So it wasn't like you're getting that straight cash, obviously. But this top up is where you lay off employees, you get approval and you engage in a top up. So two very different approaches in terms of your operations.
in related to that, Evan, they're also asking if there is a cap per employer, like there was with the 10%, max of 25K per employer.
I don't know if there's a cap per employer. I believe what the Prime Minister said this morning was that 75% up to, I believe, 58,000, which is roughly, I think, $847 per week is what the employee would be eligible. So to answer your question, I don't know other than what is entitlement for the employee.
There's a couple of people asking about support for new employees. Not sure if there's a difference there, whether you're a new employee or if you have to have worked so many hours or have made a certain amount this year. Maybe that's what they were asking related to.
I don't believe we have that level of detail at this point.
Yeah, definitely not about the wage subsidy. We don't know yet. In terms of the other benefits or potential benefits to employees, so we have, EI is the quantum you're entitled to is based on insurable earnings, obviously. And then the new Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, I believe you have to have $5,000 of income. So that's going to be that threshold.
I can speak to the question here around co-op students. I'm not sure from a wage perspective. I do know in talking to some of the post-secondary that they're, at least for the current term where students have been displaced, some of the post-secondary are offering the credit, regardless of if the student was able to complete the work term, if they aren't able to work from home. But I do believe that will be institution by institution. So if you have students, I would check with the Co-op and Career Services, your lead employer contact there.
Okay, we only have a few minutes left. I think we're all caught up on the questions. Does anybody else have anything they wanted to add? Maybe while we're waiting for questions to come in, Nancy and Suzanne, I've heard questions from folks that are in the manufacturing space about, how do you ask employees to come in if they don't feel safe, or how do you do like skeleton crews? Any information there to add?
I can share a couple of things that I've heard, although noting I don't work with a manufacturing organization today. I'm just from individuals in the community that I do know have manufacturing. These would be tech, but they do have some manufacturing. So there's a couple of things I've heard where some are looking at what that core group is that are required to continue to maintain operations. They're looking at that group, and then they're looking at if they can set an A and a B group, for example. So that if, for example, heaven forbid, anybody did get exposed, then you would essentially have to quarantine that A group or B group for a 2-week period to ensure that everybody was healthy and others on that A or B group weren't exposed. And then looking at what precautions that they can take they can put in place around additional cleaning and sanitizing of the office between those A and B group scheduled teams, and then what additional precautions that they can take to ensure that everybody stays healthy while they're there. So it really is looking at what kind of that minimum group is that is required to continue to sustain the operations, and then how you minimize any potential for exposure to those teams.
Great, thank you. I also wonder if there's any advice for first-time managers now trying to manage remote teams.
There's never been a better time for great leadership, and great leadership is important all the time. Really going back to base fundamentals of making sure the company's vision and mission and what you're trying to accomplish is clear, thinking about the kinds of behaviors that are critical, ensuring that people understand how their work continues to align to the company's mission. So all the good stuff that we always talk about, those kinds of things, really important to create that kind of alignment. Clear expectations, great feedback, good progress checking, recognition and celebration, I think the second slide that I didn't go over this morning that is in this deck was the role of the leader that was tied to the driving business outcomes model that I shared. And if it wasn't, we'll get that to you. But all of those things are going to continue to be really critical, and even more so because people, they need more clarity. They've got additional things going on in their lives, and they just need additional support.
Great, thank you, Nancy. Okay, things seem to have gone a little bit quiet on the chat, so hopefully we've been able to answer everyone's questions today. I would encourage you, if you have future questions, please connect with your Communitech advisor or customer success manager, and they will be happy to answer your question or send it along to one of our growth coaches, and we will be sure to get back to you. I will also follow up with some information from those who said they would provide additional details as it comes available. So if there's anything else, please send it to your advisor or your CSM, and thank you for your time today. And thank you, Evan, Nancy, and Suzanne for joining us and answering these questions. We really do appreciate it.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.